Hello and welcome to this first episode of Making Sense With. Today I'm very honored to have Richard Black as my guest. Richard served as a science and environment correspondent for the BBC for more than a decade and acts now as a senior advisor for the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit in the UK. It's a think tank that he created 7 years ago and which was highly instrumental in changing the politics around climate change in the UK. Richard is also the author of a book called Denied: The Rise and Fall of Climate Contrarianism, which is known as the only book in the UK about climate denial. A very important topic. So, Richard, in this first episode, you will share some perspectives on how the topic of climate change might evolve in 2021. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. So I think we find ourselves at a very interesting time at the moment. Just within the last few months, the international politics, the mood around climate change has altered immeasurably. In September, China's President Xi Jinping really stunned the international community by pledging that China would head for climate neutrality or carbon neutrality, we're still not sure quite which it is, by 2060. This is the first time that China, the world's biggest emitter, has talked about ending its contribution to climate change. We saw Japan and Korea follow shortly afterwards. The European Union put forward ambitious new pledges for cutting its emissions between now and 2030. And then we had the election of Joe Biden, who basically wants to have all electricity in the US generated by renewables within 15 years, and for the US to go towards climate neutrality by 2050. So an absolutely fantastic, extraordinary situation now as we look forward to 2021. So an awful lot to look forward to this year.
Thank you for mentioning these major shifts in politics, which is very interesting and fascinating indeed. Now we are still in a global pandemic. How do you think has the COVID pandemic impacted climate-related topics?
This is a very interesting question, because if we go back 8 or 9 months, there was an assumption, I think, in many environmental groups that there would be a link, and it would go something like this. Governments would decide that as they invested in money to rebuild after the COVID pandemic, to rebuild their economies and to rebuild employment and so on, they would do it in ways that were climate change friendly. Now, this hasn't really happened to a significant degree. And in fact, surveys show that only a small proportion of money that governments have committed is in this way of growing back greener. But what has happened is that the conversations around COVID have continued, but the conversation around climate change has really also come back to quite a large degree. And I think in large part that is because a number of governments have come forward and they're still looking at climate change. They're still seeing it as serious. They are still seeing opportunities also for their economies in making a swift switch to renewable and low carbon forms of energy. So we are seeing that there is a climate change conversation, a very active one, even in the middle of this pandemic.
Do you see any particular learnings from the pandemic that can be applied to the climate crisis?
I think the era when a government could say we can't do X or Y or Z because it's too hard, it's unthinkable, that argument doesn't really hold up anymore, because clearly they've done things to respond to the COVID pandemic, which no one really thought possible in peacetime. Also, coming back to the business point of view, we've seen particularly oil companies and car companies who have really known for years that at some point they were going to have to make a transition. And I think the COVID pandemic has really focused their attention on that a lot more. The signs on the wall just became a little clearer because of the pandemic for some of these high carbon businesses.
Richard, you mentioned that in November this year, we have the 26th UN Climate Change Conference called COP26. What do we expect from that? What's actually possible from the global perspective? What can we reach?
Sure. Well, if we look at it, first of all, from the sort of formal perspective of what countries have already agreed to do, we had the seminal Paris summit of 2015. And this brought into effect the Paris Agreement. But the Paris Agreement, lots of bits of it remain to be actioned, to actually enter into force. Governments agreed that they would try to limit global warming to 1.5 Celsius. But the pledges they all put forward in terms of reducing their emissions aren't anywhere enough to do that. And in fact, we'd be heading for a global temperature rise of something like 3 Celsius, something like that. So clearly, there needed to be some sort of mechanism where governments would revisit their pledges and they'd make them tighter. And the first turn of that ratchet is occurring at COP26. So we have already seen some governments come forward with enhanced pledges to cut their greenhouse gas emissions faster. This is also supposed to be the time at which Western governments deliver on their promise for financial support to the poorest countries in the world. They promise to be supplying at least $100 billion per year to the poorest nations to help them decarbonize and protect against climate impacts. And then there's also countries promised to put forward long-term strategies, so deep decarbonization strategies that would run to about mid-century. So all of that needs to be delivered in the coming months. They've all said this, but actually a lot of them have not got the policies in place to start driving that transition. So really, part of this year, I think, is about building confidence among those governments that they are all serious about this. And the more confident they are in each other, the more likely they are to put strong measures in place. So in terms of what the world can come up with, I think what we're basically looking for at Glasgow is something that delivers on all those promises that have been made.
I assume this applies for the EU as well, but where do you in particular see its priorities and role?
Yes, so I think in terms of what the EU does within its own borders, the key is to get policies in place that really start to cut carbon very quickly and start reshaping those bits of the economy where it's going to take, 10, 20 years to reshape them. The pledge that the EU has put forward for its own decarbonisation is quite strong. So now everyone looking at the EU says, now it's time to deliver. Where are your policies that will really accelerate this transition towards renewable energy? In terms of the EU diplomatically, an amazing opportunity here. With Joe Biden coming into the US, you now add the third economic superpower. All of these three blocks working together. This is the big prize, I think, for this year and the coming few years as well. What can they do collectively to really change the game, to really accelerate? That in principle is, I think, where the really interesting game lies during 2021.
Yeah, looking at the UK, because you're still in the middle of the Brexit, and there are some people that were wondering about if there are any negative impacts that the Brexit has on potential climate topics, or rather not.
Yes, I mean, in terms of how fast the UK decarbonises, Brexit really doesn't make any difference at all because the UK's own targets have always been stronger than the EU's targets. The thing is that for COP21, the UK and the EU should logically be working hand in hand because their interests are almost identical. Both want to secure strong agreements that bring in a majority of the world. So we have seen from the EU side, Ursula von der Leyen saying that she absolutely wants to work with the UK government hand in glove. We haven't yet seen any such statement from the UK side.
How do you, this is a topic change now, a topic switch. How do you actually assess the importance or significance of foundations and philanthropists in the battle against the climate crisis? What can they do? What can their role be in 2021?
Well, there's no doubt that philanthropy is absolutely essential to all efforts in climate change. It's supporting, whether it's supporting of research, whether it's supporting of communication networks, whether it's detailed work and supporting developing country governments, this kind of thing. Basically we would not be where we are on climate change were it not for the support of foundations across the world. And I think where we are now is a really interesting time where, given that you have so much of the world economy where governments have publicly committed to decarbonising quickly and reaching net zero by mid-century, Then the key question is how. How are you going to do this? How are you going to negotiate the technological changes, but also the economic structures, the different ways, for example, that taxation is going to have to work in a world that's largely without oil to support national coffers? What about pension funds and the way that they're invested often into high carbon stocks? So there's an awful lot of this how do we do it stuff to be supported. I think there are a few ways in which I think foundations can play a really key role. One is by looking at key countries and breaking it down and saying, okay, what are the barriers? What actually has to happen over the next 5 years in order to get on track for the 2030 targets and then for the deep decarbonisation in 2050? What are the barriers? How can we support this? I kind of view the philanthropic input not so much as being about, supporting the kind of big global transformation in one go, but about supporting literally hundreds of small, specific transformations that all add up to that one big picture, and making sure that whoever is being funded, has a theory of change that is really coherent and actually adds up, so that the philanthropists can be fairly sure that their money is going to be effectively spent and they are going to see some concrete and absolutely necessary change at the end of the year or 3 years or 5 years or whatever the length of their investment. But I think underlying this and tying in with it is this idea that you do have now about 2/3 of the world economy committed on paper to net zero by mid-century. We really have a window of opportunity, I think, in 2021 and the following years. Things really have changed that rapidly in such an exciting direction.
Richard, thank you so much for this insightful discussion. I think that we'll come back to you in the course of the year as things have further progressed. I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.